Steve. Well, welcome everyone. It's really nice to see old faces and new in the participants list. So welcome again. My name is Kate Quinn and I'm co-convener of the UCL Institute of the Americas Caribbean Seminar Series, along with my colleagues, Professor Gad Human and Dr. Steve Cushion. And it's a real pleasure for me to welcome our speaker today, Dr. Ryan Cecil Jobson. Ryan is Assistant Professor of Anthropology at the University of Chicago, where he also holds faculty appointments in the Center for Latin American Studies and the Department of Race, Diaspora and Indigeneity. He's also co-editor-in-chief of the journal Transforming Anthropology and sits on the editorial board of Small Axe. His research engages issues of energy and extractivism, states and sovereignty, climate and crisis, race and capital. And we can see these diverse interests in his recent publications, which include a new introduction to Michel Rolf-Touillot's classic study, Peasants and Capital, Dominica in the World Economy, which was published again in 2025. In his article, I love the title, Radiation and the Meaning of Power, CLR James and the Struggle for Chaguaramas, which was published in Small Axe last year. And of course, the book that we're here today to celebrate, the Petro-State Masquerade, published by the University of Chicago Press in 2024. Of interest to many of our audience here, particularly our compañeros from Caribbean Labor Solidarity, Ryan has also featured in 2 episodes of the excellent Working Class History podcast, speaking on Trinidad's 1937 general strike. And he can also be found on the excellent blog site. There's a link to it in the chat, Clash, Voices for a Caribbean Federation from Below. It's a delight to host him for this seminar today, which before we came on air, as it were, we're just saying how pertinent it is. So we're really looking forward, excuse me, to hear more about this fascinating and original work, the Petro-State Masquerade, Oil, Sovereignty and Power in Trinidad and Tobago. So over to you, Ryan.
Thank you, Kate, for that lovely introduction. It's a real pleasure to join you all, well, this morning here in Chicago and this evening over across the pond. So again, thank you for having me. Just as a bit of an overview, I'm going to try to be as expedient as possible with my remarks, but I'm going to trace some of the arguments of the book through sort of 5 scenes or vignettes that are based on archival or ethnographic evidence. And for each, I'm going to read an excerpt from the book and then discuss the context behind each. But just as a sort of framing introduction, the central questions that the book engages are really how fossil fuels and political power came to be indelibly linked, or another way of putting it is how the market futures of oil and gas came to be linked to the political futures of the nation state in Trinidad and Tobago, but also how this hyphenated political form, if we take the 2 sort of clauses of the Petro-State, how that political form came to be understood as permanent and indivisible through something that I call in the text a masquerade of permanence. But with no further ado, I'm going to jump into the first scene from the text itself. The odyssey of the Deepwater Champion, which is pictured here, begins at the Hyundai Heavy Industries shipyard in Ulsan, South Korea. Commissioned in 2010 by the Texas-founded, Switzerland-based contractor Transocean at a cost of $740 million US, Hyundai fabricators outfitted the 6th-generation ultra-deepwater drillship with 2 rig stations equipped to drill in up to 12,000 feet of water and to subterranean depths of 40,000 feet. Drill ships, prized for their mobility enabled by autonomous propulsion systems, travel expediently from one drill site to the next without the aid of independent towing vessels. These capabilities allowed the Deepwater Champion to make fast work of deepwater hydrocarbon frontiers. Initially leased to ExxonMobil for offshore operations in Turkey, the drill ship completed its maiden voyage under a Vanuatuan flag of convenience when it passed through the Bosphorus Strait in Istanbul. After this pilot drilling program, it entered the territorial waters of Romania for a venture in the Black Sea, And the Deepwater Champion then crossed the Atlantic Ocean to the US Gulf of Mexico, where it began a 3-year contract in June of 2012 before exiting ahead of schedule to spud an exploratory well in Guyana in 2015. The resulting Liza-1 well generated the first major offshore discovery in Guyana with a productive potential of more than 700 million barrels of crude oil equivalent. So unconventional hydrocarbon frontiers, such as the Deepwater, ushered in an era of fossil fuel abundance. Advances in extractive technologies and drilling techniques tempered somber forecasts of peak oil. Enjoying the spoils of this abundance for the first half-decade of its productive life, the operators of the Deepwater Champion did not concern themselves with whether another frontier would emerge. The commercial viability of the Deepwater offered no occasion for pause. Rather than a question of if another deepwater frontier would present itself, it remained a matter of where and when it would deploy to next. But the boom did not last. In the final months of 2014, crude prices nosedived when competition between Saudi crude and US shale produced a glut in world oil supplies. The fossil fuel industry long rested on an assumption of market futures marked by regular and predictable cycles of boom and bust. Even when price fluctuations persisted, controlled production cuts by the member states of OPEC, led by its Saudi vanguard, stabilized crude oil markets. The renaissance of US oil, driven by the adoption of hydraulic fracturing or fracking techniques, tilted the balance of geopolitical might and altered perceptions of oil as a diminishing resource. Diagnosed by publications like The Economist as a geopolitical skirmish of sheikhs versus shale, in which the United States toppled Saudi Arabia as the swing producer capable of setting oil markets, the price of oil dropped below $27 US per barrel in January 2016, its lowest level since May 2003, and a 75% drop from its previous peak at nearly $108 in June 2014. For the Deepwater Champion, the bear market inaugurated a moment of uncertainty. After the drillship's Guyana venture in 2015, Transocean failed to secure a contract for its juggernaut vessel. Gambling on a long-term market recovery and renaissance in deepwater investments, Transocean opted for a strategy of cold stacking. It powered down its drillship fleet, emptied its crews, and indefinitely stationed its abandoned ships offshore. Unlike a more common practice of warm stacking, when drillships are kept running by a minimal staff in between contracts, cold stacking served as a novel cost-saving measure for Transocean to weather the market tides. In the immediate term, the strategy assured shareholders of the company's ability to kill time and curb losses ahead of a market recovery. While reassuring to shareholders, cold stacking risks the long-term viability of Transocean's deepwater program. For as long as deepwater investments flourished, drill ships such as the Deepwater Champion had never been shut off. Accustomed to the frenzied itineraries of deepwater operations, one Transocean electrician reasoned, and I quote, that its drill ships were not designed to sit idle. Moreover, it remained unclear what would happen if and when cold stacked drill ships returned to operation. To do so would require engineers to reprogram thousands of drilling presets. The cold stack gamble was twofold. First, Transocean placed its bets on a long-term recovery of oil and gas markets. Second, it wagered that the capital frozen in cold stacked drill ships could be powered up and returned to active drilling. The Deepwater Champion set off on its final journey in 2016 when it joined Transocean's flotilla of mothballed rigs in the Gulf of Paria off the west coast of Trinidad. A Bloomberg news brief relayed the inauspicious scene as follows. In a far corner of the Caribbean Sea, one of those idyllic spots touched most days by little more than a fisherman chasing blue marlin, billions of dollars of the world's finest oil equipment bobs quietly in the water. Cashing in on its relatively calm waters, at least at that point, we might say, as maritime storage for inactive rigs, the government of Trinidad and Tobago leased offshore acreage to Transocean at the minimal cost of $8,000 US per ship per day. So this is how I open the introduction to the book. And in a lot of ways, I want us to sort of displace the extractive geography and political geography of Trinidad by thinking about how to study Trinidad oil necessitates that we be alert to political currents both within its shores and far beyond its borders. It requires us too to be alert to the kind of infrastructural and market transformations that have colored the oil and gas industry over the past 20 to 30 years. But all of this, I asked sort of how Trinidad and Tobago comes to be legible as something that we call a petrostate. That this is a sort of political neologism. And again, sort of what kind of market forces permit this to be the case? And also, beyond the presence of hydrocarbons themselves, how does Trinidad ultimately inherit a moment in which the very equipment that's necessary to extract offshore oil and gas to reverse a sort of decline in production domestically is actually sitting idly in the water? So how does the petrostate form persist even at a moment when production pauses, retreats, and investment disappears? Which I'd like to sort of consider with you all also. So I made reference also to the calm waters of the Southern Caribbean that have been decidedly less calm over the past several weeks and months. So this is something that I'd love to talk about in the Q&A because it's been quite an experience to continue to update this talk as developments have emerged since the book's publication in December of 2024. Just to offer a bit of background, again, now many more in the audience are probably familiar with the fact that Trinidad at its closest point lies only 7 miles from the Venezuelan mainland. It means that Trinidad and Venezuela share a common geology. But also, despite the fact that Trinidad holds such a minor standing in the sort of global orbit of oil and gas operations, I want to emphasize how much this looms extremely large for the national economy of Trinidad. So first, just to offer some stats about how Trinidad and Tobago figures into the sort of world markets for oil. Trinidad accounts for just 0.15% of global natural gas reserves and 0.04% of crude oil reserves. At the same time, again, the fact that foreign exchange earnings and sort of state revenues are largely derived from oil, gas, and petrochemical windfalls. So in the book, I try to sort of communicate how this problem of scale is inherited by the petrostate in Trinidad and Tobago. The fact that Trinidad is not capable of setting oil markets the way that the US or the Saudis are able to, but nonetheless is dependent on these same sort of market and hydrocarbon currents. Here, this image is a sort of map of the offshore and deep water acreage in Trinidad and Tobago. Those that are sort of shaded in sort of the reddish or pinkish color were those that were actually licensed out to multinational companies by 2021. This map was produced for a bid round for a series of deep water blocks that were shaded in the sort of yellow color. What I want to communicate here is the way that multinationals approach Trinidad and Tobago in the same fashion that this map represents. That this bird's eye view prevails both in these corporate offices as well as we might say in a lot of state ministries. What they see is that with the sort of nuances of the onshore are effaced, that the sort of onshore geography is flat, is taken for granted, and rather there's an effort to locate through, again, seismic technologies and exploration, the most opportune ways to extract oil and gas from these offshore and deep water blocks. I was also very curious in the process of my research. I spent the bulk of my time in Trinidad between 2014 and 2015 during this global decline in oil and gas markets. And I was very curious about why this didn't register as a crisis, particularly for the state. In some ways, it began to register as a crisis for working people as they bore the brunt of the windback of social welfare programs and other infrastructural investments that were funded by oil and gas revenues. But nonetheless, there was this assertion that the sort of petrostate would always renew itself. There would always be sort of more complex or deeper reserves of oil and gas that would allow the petrostate to enter another moment of prosperity. So particularly the deep water and its sort of vast productive potential was what those sort of bets hinged on. So I want to talk about that a bit more to say that, again, the sort of entire sort of value chain of the oil and gas industry hinges on the availability of crude oil, but actually especially natural gas as a feedstock for several downstream operations. So in a lot of ways, this has been called the Trinidad and Tobago model of oil and gas management, where the production of finished products, especially starting in the 1970s, iron and steel, ammonia-based fertilizers, petrochemicals, particularly at the Point Lisas industrial estate that was funded by the revenues of the oil boom in the 1970s, as well as starting in the 1990s, the production of liquefied natural gas at Point Fortin. So all of this was very opportune for the state. It created a lot of revenue streams and, again, foreign exchange earnings. This becomes a problem when the upstream, the primary production of oil and gas, begins to run out. And we've seen the impact that this has had, particularly with the shuttering of downstream facilities and refineries as a result of the lack of availability of crude supplies and natural gas supplies. So, just to bring this to the present, I want to talk a little bit about the contours of what I call the state masquerade or the masquerade of permanence in the book. As many of you know, sort of Keith Rowley assumed the office of the Prime Minister in 2015, after which he continued in that role for approximately 10 years when his hand-appointed successor, Stuart Young, was defeated by Kamla Prasad-Bissessar just last year. To talk about the contours of Rowley's masquerade is that after this sort of moment of declining production, Rowley's masquerade really took shape around a politics of austerity, the sort of winding back of spending, the shuttering of onshore industries, petrochemical facilities, and especially the oil refinery at Pointe-à-Pierre in 2018. The picture here that I took was actually at a protest by the Oilfield Workers Trade Union after the shuttering of the refinery was announced. Of course, this sent thousands of workers to the breadline. It limited Trinidad and Tobago's capacity for foreign exchange earnings through oil sales and exports. And what we really saw last year, actually, is sort of at the polls, Trinbagonian voters sort of noticed the failure of Rowley's Mas to remedy the crisis of the Petro-State, that the promise that they would eventually locate new supplies of oil and gas to bring, for instance, the refinery back on stream, to bring petrochemical facilities back on stream, failed miserably. And that also we can talk about led certain outfits like the OWTU to take a very clearly rightward turn and align themselves with Kamla Prasad-Bissessar and her own masquerade. I'll just skip over this briefly. Again, I'll be glad to talk about this in the Q&A because I don't have time to address it. It would be an entirely different talk. But the sort of authoritarian masquerade that Prasad-Bissessar has taken on, both through her promise to sort of eradicate Venezuelan migrants, to eradicate criminals using stand your ground legislation, as well as her sort of alliances with the Trump administration and Marco Rubio's State Department around the drone strikes in the Southern Caribbean, as well as we also now know the sort of recent invasion of Venezuela. I want us to talk about how this becomes another sort of contour of the masquerade that allows, again, the Petro-State to persist at a moment of productive decline. That the turn to authoritarianism, the turn to xenophobia is a response to the failure to unlock these new sort of streams of prosperity. So I will be sort of happy to talk about this in the Q&A. In the book, what I do is try to trace the origins of what I call the masquerade of permanence. So I was very curious as I encountered this sense that the Petro-State would always renew itself. I wanted to know when this kind of perspective originally took hold. So this led me as an anthropologist to do something fairly unorthodox, which is to spend quite a lot of time in archives, both in Trinidad as well as in London, in order to sort of track the early history of the oil and gas industry in the 20th century. Trinidad, of course, has a commercial oil industry from 1908, and to think about, again, sort of when this discourse of permanence actually takes hold. So I'm going to finally turn to the second vignette here on the origins of the masquerade of permanence. So after the market crash of 1929, the outlook for the new decade in Trinidad appeared bleak. Export commodities such as cocoa, sugar, and oil traded below their cost of production. Unemployment spiked further after a rare hurricane struck Trinidad in 1933 and devastated the agricultural lands of Deep South. The price of oil dropped as low as 50 cents per barrel, drilling operations shuttered. But Trinidadians entered the latter half of the 1930s with great expectations fueled by resurgent oil markets. Unlike with sugar and cocoa, demand for oil recovered quickly. As it expanded, oil promised to absorb the reserves of labor who had refused the plantation system. And with it, oil provided relative dignity, industrial know-how, and social mobility to its predominantly masculine workforce. In January 1936, a motley alliance of colonial legislators, oil magnates, labor leaders, and rank-and-file workers demonstrated at the Princess Building in Port of Spain in support of an imperial oil preference. Advocating for a guaranteed market in the metropole, proponents of the oil preference underscored its benefits for colonial workers and the necessity of a stable oil supply for Great Britain in the event of war in Europe. Oil, indeed, was the object of incongruous desires. Even as the Trinidad Guardian reported a boom in every industry in its debut issue of 1937, oil held the greatest promise for the economic future of the colony. Oil flowed aplenty, industrial development proceeded in kind. Trinidad leaseholders, which was a mainstay in the local oil industry since 1913, expanded the capacity of its Pointe-a-Pierre refinery to keep pace with this new boom in crude oil production. In the early months of 1937, heavy machinery, including heat exchangers and industrial cylinders, graced flatbed lorries and railways bound for Pointe-a-Pierre. For the moment, more oil meant more opportunities for working people to refuse the indignity of plantation estate labor. Day by day, oil companies engaged workers by the scores to cope with the increasing activities of the fields. While oil stirred corporate earnings and popular fantasy, debates raged over the future of the industry. In 1937, Trinidad was the single largest supplier of oil in the British Empire. Workers and industry officials alike underscored the strategic value of Trinidad on the brink of war in Europe, yet they remained keenly aware of its precarious standing in a world where military might and political power increasingly depended on petroleum resources. Just as the innovation of beet sugar ushered the decline of the Caribbean sugar industry, the West Indian sugar lobby, in the 19th century, the discovery of frontier reserves threatened Trinidad's oil industry in the 20th. Despite this, local stakeholders and technologists offered confident forecasts of future production. They fell firmly into two camps. The first, represented by the Trinidadian barrister and politician Sir Lennox O'Reilly, characterized oil as a wasting asset that would disappear in the near term and whose revenue should be reinvested in other industries. Sorry, one moment. The second, endorsed overwhelmingly by geologists and the local press, treated the oil reserves of Trinidad as inexhaustible, and that's their term. Experts agreed that production had barely scratched the surface of the vast onshore deposits and even argued that oil was a renewable asset sustained by, I quote, a continual process of subterranean chemical action at some indeterminate point between Trinidad and the mainland of Venezuela. Expecting that industrial operations would one day cover the entire island, they imagined the entirety of Trinidad transformed into one large oil city. And that's what I sort of have on the screen here. I know it's a bit blurry. Fueled by these supposed subterranean transformations, the interminable expansion of oil presented a facile resolution to the labor troubles of the British West Indies. So again, here, this was drawn from the Port of Spain Gazette in 1937. We can see here that this masquerade of permanence that's sort of taken on and appropriated by Raleigh, by Prasad Besseser, by Eric Williams, and basically all post-colonial statesmen and stateswomen, actually traces its origins to the colonial theater of oil in Trinidad. So I'm thinking about, again, sort of how the masquerade of permanence finds its origin in a myth of subterranean chemical action that masquerades as scientific orthodoxy. but also sort of supplies a development telos that sees the plantation as being replaced and supplanted by one large oil city. That again, this is the promise for Caribbean modernity and development out of the plantation system. This becomes one way to absorb those who are sort of made redundant by the sort of decline of West India sugar. Um, but again, at all junctures, this kind of masquerade of permanence registers unevenly. So during these moments of production slowdowns and withdrawal of investment, working people are the ones who are compelled to, as we say, bend their belly through austerity measures and preserve the state as this sovereign authority that allows it to continue to pursue sort of exploration and production today in the deep water. So in the book, I'm alert to sort of the other sort of side of this coin of the state masquerade, which I call the people's masquerade, and I trace through the sort of self-organization and activity of colonial workers who were interrupting these scripts of permanence, interrupting these scripts of the petrostate from below. So in particular, I spend an entire chapter sort of profiling again the general strike of 1937 and thinking about how this sort of provides a formative instantiation of what I'm calling the People's Masquerade. So I'm going to read a couple more chapters, excuse me, pages, and then I will sort of discuss. So on June 9th, 1937, reports of a strike threat in the oil fields surfaced. Soon after, a detachment of the constabulary force deployed from the barracks in San Fernando. Police stood guard along the roadways to escort buses of replacement workers to the oil fields. They intimidated home rule party gatherings, armed with bullwhips, and threatened the assemblies with violence. As the Colonial Battalion and company officials dug in their heels, a memo authored by Uriah Butler, who was the sort of evangelical leader of the oil field workers, circulated among oil field and public works employees calling for a sit-down strike on Tuesday, June 22nd. Still, the government and labor leadership underestimated his following, holding until the final hours that it was not expected that many laborers will comply with his circular. The sit-down strike began ahead of schedule, spontaneously in the early morning of June 19th. At midnight, members of the graveyard shift assumed their posts at leaseholders' Forest Reserve oil field. Working by moonlight, they continued until daybreak, when they abandoned their tools and rotary drilling controls. When overseers caught wind of the strike, they summoned white American and European drillers from the field headquarters. Many had previously worked as roughnecks before graduating to management, and moved hastily to fire boilers and salvage drill pipes prior to freezing in the soil. The West Indian workers looked on in amusement. Unexpectedly drafted into industrial work, senior staff proved clumsy and inept. Hundreds of barrels of oil ran to waste in canals and gutters. By 7 a.m., the striking night shift met the daylight workers at the gate and instructed them to return home. Dancing and singing along the road to Faizabad Junction, the crowd grew as it passed Trinidad Consolidated oil fields, where more joined the walkout. Within hours, police arrived at the oil fields to compel the strikers to resume work. When they refused, the police dispatch threatened to shoot striking workers if they continued to trespass on company lands. By the following afternoon, the strike grew as the remaining employees at Forest Reserve, as well as Labre, Guapo, and Parilands, were forced off the estates. At Faizabad Junction, the Saturday traffic ballooned with striking workers who joined their comrades at local rum shops. The crowd of nearly 500 men and women assembled in the yard of a local proprietor, where Uriah Butler delivered an impassioned address. Police arrived to execute an arrest warrant for Butler, but their efforts to read the warrant were drowned out by shouting as the crowd pelted the policemen with sticks, stones, and bottles. Two inspectors drew their revolvers in retreat, which left the notorious Corporal Charlie King, an African Trinidadian policeman, alone in the melee. He attempted to take Butler into custody, but when rebuffed, sought refuge at a nearby shop and hid between two bags of flour. A group comprised mostly of women who were followers of Butler followed in hot pursuit, located King, and beat him violently. Cornered in the back room, he jumped from an elevated window, but the furious mob circled him below. They soaked King in Petromax gasoline and ignited the flames with a match. And any of you who know Trinidad well know that this area of Faizabad to this day is still called Charlie King Junction. So as King burned, the mob cut telephone lines to San Fernando, and police and civilians exchanged barrages of stones and bullets. As the crowd began to disband for the evening around 11 p.m., black clouds of smoke billowed over the forest after saboteurs set fire to a pump jack several miles away. With Faizabad momentarily under their control, the masses turned to oil as the accelerant of a general strike. By Tuesday, on Monday morning, nearly 1,000 workers assigned to the Dubs cracking units and tank farms at Pointe-à-Pierre reported for the start of the daytime shift. Large in number, these refinery workers controlled an essential choke point in the supply chain of oil to the British Empire. While a strike at a single oil field could be compensated for by drilling elsewhere, the shutdown of crude storage and refining operations could bring the entire industry to a standstill. Minutes after the open of the working day, each unit assembled into small meetings, and out of these shop floor conferences, a larger contingent assembled and marched through the facility, ordering a stoppage of work. Seamlessly, the crowd grew to 900, fighting off resident overseers as they marched off the estate. The workers refused the offer of the Trinidad leaseholder's manager and marched south to San Fernando. The unemployed joined them and looted goods from shops along the route. And in the form of a carnival procession, strikers ordered the closing of businesses while, and I quote, masquerading in the streets, singing, "We ain't working nowhere." This kind of presages a popular soca anthem from a couple of years ago. I'm not working, not going to work today. Along the route, they compelled the managers of the St. Madeleine sugar factory to cease operations. And in San Fernando, they shut down the power station and telephone exchange. Confronted by a volunteer police force from Port of Spain, they levied stones at the officers who returned a volley of bullets. One striker instantly dropped dead. Several others fell to the ground shot. The crowd dispersed, but the strike continued. On Tuesday, the entire oil belt stretching from Point Fortin to Palo Seco joined the strike. And by Wednesday, strike fever gripped the entire island. In Port of Spain, the strikers replicated the Carnivalesque formation of their comrades in South. Carrying a red banner bearing the title of the Negro Cultural and Welfare Association, cadres Elma Francois, Jim Barrett, and Caesar Ashby addressed the crowd. The mob, carrying sticks and pieces of iron, marched up and down the commercial thoroughfares of Frederick Street and Charlotte Street, shuttering shops and market vendors along the road. As a constable stationed at the scene later put it in his testimony to the Royal Commission of Inquiry, the mob was, I quote, not disorderly. The people seemed to treat it as carnival time. So again, here, I sort of, in my efforts to locate the origins of the People's Masquerade in the archive, what I found, and I was very struck by this, was the fact that contemporary observers in 1937 described the general strike, which of course occurred outside the traditional contours of the carnival season, as assuming sort of the form of the carnivalesque. I think about how this recurs throughout the history of Trinidad and Tobago, the way that the masquerade resurfaces at moments outside the carnival season as a source of sort of insurgent or insurrectionary potential. So this also compels us to think differently about what we understand to be the primary sort of venues or organs of working class organization. Here we might think of, a masquerade that doesn't presume an end, that doesn't expect to come to a conclusion on Tuesday before Ash Wednesday and the Lenten season begins. How might this be sort of recruited to another kind of politics, and particularly an interruption of both the Petro-State and its masquerade of permanence? So again, this to sort of take you through my journey in the archives, and this now is from the sort of colonial office records at Kew. I was also thinking about, again, how the very origins of the masquerade are sort of narrated through a confrontation between the colonial state and the sort of designs of power of ordinary working people in the post-emancipation Caribbean. So many of you are familiar with the story if you've ever been to the Cambolet reenactment during Carnival in Trinidad that Eintu Springer spearheaded several decades ago. You'll know the story quite well. But again, sort of the efforts by the colonial state to limit the contours of the masquerade, particularly the banning of drums and the banning of flambeaux or torches, again, sort of reveals to us the way that the colonial state is always very anxious about the insurgent potential of the masquerade. So if we look here in this extract, it says that Captain Baker came to Queen's House to report that the previous night a torch of the masqueraders had been extinguished by the police, that immediately this was done, the police had been assailed on all sides with bottles and stones, held in preparation in houses, and many of the force, 38 out of a total of 150, had been hurt, some badly. So this is to say that this masquerade, this that was being enacted by Afro-Trinidadians in the post-emancipation context, for the colonial state, there was a question of where does the line, where can the line be drawn between what is simply a masquerade and what can become an insurrection, right? So the masquerade is actually, for the colonial state, a site that they have to police in order to limit its insurrectionary potential. And then the question becomes, again, how does the same form lend itself to masquerades outside of the carnival season, to other kinds of working class insurgencies? So this is something that I explore in the introduction. And we might think also of the way that masquerade informs a reading of other moments. And I think Kate will be able to speak to this as well, but sort of other instantiations of what I'm calling the people's masquerade, which interrupts the narratives that the state crafts about itself, particularly around sort of the notion of petroleum and permanence. We can also think about, for instance, the March to Caroni in 1970, which the late Brinsley Samaru called the sort of high watermark of post-colonial politics in Trinidad, as its own masquerade of unity, right? The idea that Black power in Trinidad was going to mean a sort of broad, multiracial working class movement that had to be enacted through this march to Caroni, through the articulation of links between particularly sort of Afro-Trinidadian workers in the East-West corridor and then Indian workers in central Trinidad or Caroni. I believe Soraya's on the call today, but I also just wanted to draw your attention to the way that this can be taken up in other modalities today. So shout out to Soraya Muhammad, who crafted this entire mas that was taking up the title of my book, the Petro-State Masquerade, in order to sort of to re-script it through parrot Pierrot Grenade. So again, sort of thinking about the way that Pierrot Grenade as a kind of philosopher, an ordinary philosopher, can then sort of re-script this as the Petro-State Masquerade. So we can think about both the sort of impacts of the Petro-State on flora and fauna, but also the cultures of automobility that also subtend this masquerade of permanence, right? How are these attachments to the Petro-State? How do they persist at a very sort of mundane or ordinary level? So again, I just wanted to share this because shout out to Soraya for thinking about how the masquerade, again, can be appropriated and politicized toward these particular ends and critiques. For me, the majority of my sort of ethnographic fieldwork centered around a group that was active from around sort of 2011 to 2016 called the Highway Reroute Movement. And particularly, they were sort of responding to a major highway development in South Trinidad that was threatening many families with displacement. So this was a disputed segment of the highway from Debe to Mondesi. Again, that emerged alongside the longstanding sort of proposal for a highway to Point Fortin. This was one of the signature developments of Kamala Prasad-Besesar's first sort of term as prime minister from 2010 to 2015. And in the book, I think about sort of how the tactics that we employed within the highway reroute movement represent what I call road work, sort of an occupation of public space, a way of accounting for the distance between the narratives that the state crafts about itself and the ordinary realities on the ground. Again, as a strategy of semiotic interruption that interrupts the image of the petrostate and its presumed, again, sort of masquerade of permanence. So I'm going to read a few final pages and then please let me know how I'm doing on time because I may forego the last section if need be. In the
Yeah,
final months of, oh, go ahead.
sorry, on time, you got 5, 6, 7, 8 minutes if you like.
All right, let me jump right in then. I think I can get through everything. So in the final months of 2014, a decline in oil prices triggered fears of economic recession in Trinidad and Tobago. When markets contracted, the government altered the national budget, initially pegged to an oil price of $80 per barrel to a revised estimate of $45. Nevertheless, the government prepared for parliamentary elections, and its representatives assured the public there would be no cutbacks to its signature development projects, including the sort of Point Fortin Highway. In June, following the assurances of government officials and technocrats, the highway reroute movement and allied trade union outfits, including the OWTU, convened to tour the route of the disputed segment and survey construction progress. And this is the video clip on the right. We gathered at the home of one of the movement's longstanding members, which stood at the intended site of the Mondesi interchange. When I arrived, Vidya C. Prasad, a retired oil man and familiar presence at the movement camp in Port of Spain, gestured in my direction and continued down a path overgrown with brush. I traced the steps through the tall grasses to an open clearing that marked the proposed site of the interchange. Despite claims by the government ministers that construction had proceeded past a proverbial point of no return, we encountered only scattered patches of tilled earth. As we surveyed the landscape, he began. The government people, they say and they're progressing, and that the people are cooperating, and they're being handsomely compensated. It is not so. We traded sarcastic barbs about the sitting government's desperation to win votes in the upcoming election. But then in a more serious tone, he recalled, now I've seen in NIDCO, the office, a drawing, what they say is petit monde. But when I looked at it, they sketch it out like a development. And I tend to believe is they want to get rid of all the people that are scattered and put them there and seize the lands. That is the whole idea behind the highway. So the scheme he was referring to, which is a public housing project in the nearby community of Petit Morne, was no secret. The National Infrastructure Development Office, press releases openly advertised subsidized land and housing for relocated homeowners who were being displaced by the highway. He cast doubt, though, on the purportedly benevolent displacement of citizens. As he recalled, an earlier route for the highway was proposed and cleared decades prior. The plan for this additional highway from Debe to Mondesi, in his version of events, was invested more in land grabbing than road building. It was unclear whether this land grab was motivated by oil sands reserves, as some suspected, or just the infamous kickbacks associated with construction contracts. In either case, the function or direction of the road mattered little. All that was needed was more road. Shout out to Masho. Once the bus and its occupants arrived, our group of approximately 24 gathered to canvass the highway route and review the construction underway. We stopped at the proposed locations of several interchanges, none of which showed any signs of road work. Only as we neared the junction in Debe did we encounter a single stretch of turned soil flanked by 2 idle bulldozers. During one stop on our tour, OWTU President General Ansel Roger briefed reporters on his findings, and I quote, their justification for continuing this or wanting to complete the segment of the highway is built on a lie, that it is some 60 or 70% completed. When you hear their supporters say build the highway, they're talking about build up their pockets, and that is what we're against. His words resounded against the backdrop of the open clearing that supplied evidence of this deceit. The money had been spent. For what was billed as a $5.2 billion TT project, more than $5 billion had already been paid out, yet there was no road. Less than 1 month before national elections in 2015, the Debe interchange opened to the public, and this is pictured on the left of your screen. At the ribbon-cutting ceremony, Prime Minister Prasad Bisesar stood on the pristine asphalt in front of a large banner that read, Ma Kamla, thank you for this highway. White, red, and black confetti showered down on the Prime Minister and the mocha jumbies arranged beside her before coming to rest on the finished pavement. While the highway remained far from complete, the interchange was called upon to ease any doubts regarding its timely completion. In the spirit of Carnival, the Day Bay interchange masqueraded as the highway in its entirety. The deteriorating public coffers and long stretches of untouched land along the route of the highway told another story. The road remained unfinished. Its destination remained unclear. Instead, the fetish of the road was rendered in its purest form. It was simply more road. So again, I'm just in this moment, just to very briefly relay, I'm thinking about road work as a kind of repertoire of protest, of interruption. And we might say that the highway reroute movement and its own road work was ultimately not successful at displacing this masquerade of permanence. In fact, we might say that even the Black Power revolution of 1970 or the general strike of 1937 were also ultimately unsuccessful at displacing the petrostate and its own masquerade. Yet I'm always thinking about sort of where these new sites of working class activity might emerge, and again, sort of what it means to take seriously how these repertoires function. And again, we could talk in Q&A about this coalition that emerged on the road between the trade unions and the highway reroute movement, and sort of how we might assess where those two groups find themselves now. Kate, if you'll indulge me, I'm just going to read a final section from the coda that I think will be sort of an excellent way to open up for discussion. So this comes from the coda. I should say that there's a, a running current throughout this text of a kind of subtle dialogue with CLR James that I try to make explicit in the conclusion. But maybe I'll just leave it there and I'll read and then we'll open it up for a Q&A. So alongside his more numerable and celebrated reflections on cricket, James dedicated his platform in The Nation, the PNM newspaper, to reasonings on Carnival. As opposed to the demarcated boundaries of the cricket pitch, where a batsman takes his turn standing in the crease, and for all intents and purposes, he is his side, as James put it, the Carnival Road March clears a space of creative abundance beyond prescriptive rules and conventions. James venerates the seasonal preparations for Carnival as something of a dress rehearsal for true independence, where ordinary people display the capacity to govern themselves and enter political life on their own authority. As he writes, hundreds of people get together in order to organize the display of a certain kind, put themselves under a leader, make all the necessary preparations, make their displays for 2 days, and then after a period settle down to do it again. The thing to note is that it is self-organization. The meticulous preparation for Carnival, the design of costumes, the gathering of bands, the parade of trucks, the revelers of the Road March, are not a diversion from the realm of politics. Here we observe the greatest demonstration of power among Caribbean people. The role then of the Caribbean intellectual is not to dispense power by decree, but to testify to the imminent capacity for power that the Carnival masquerade beholds. In James's day and our own, conservative critics have chastised Carnival goers for their conspicuous expenditure of personal savings to participate in the annual bacchanal. James is firm in his retort, as he says, "Let the heathen rage." Power does not emanate from the individual scrunting or restraint. Rather, it's precisely the commitment of the Trimbagonian people to gather year over year for a fleeting masquerade that confirms this capacity for power. And again, and this is something I believe Christian's on the call and has written about this, but sort of James sort of reflects on this and says the energy, the creativity, and the capacity for independent organization, which they show in Carnival, will easily be transferred to another object. So he's always thinking about how the energy that subtends the masquerade might end up fueling sort of new politics and working class self-organization. And just to conclude, and this is where the book ends as well, the Petro-State Masquerade gathers power from its presumptive monopoly on legitimate violence. The ability of the Petro-State to preserve itself against failed bid rounds, deep-water dry holes, and shuttered industrial plants requires that the state dole out its brute force to contain the masses of people made redundant by the decline of oil as a pathway to mobility beyond the plantation. Of course, when I talk about violence, I wrote this before Kamala's new administration, but we can think about how this violence takes on a more direct tenor under her administration. As the state retreats behind concrete walls and glass windows, however, It commands ordinary people to band their belly through long cycles of austerity, cutbacks, and self-discipline. While the petrostate maintains its pursuit of new reserves of carbon power through offshore and deepwater plays, the people are expected to suspend their power to play a mas. You can also think about Kamala's attacks on Carnival and fetes as well. Our preparations for the impending confrontation cannot shepherd ordinary people towards statutory avenues of political participation and redress. Instead, there must be a call to evangelize our own masquerades of power. Let the heathen rage. Don't stop the masquerade. I'll leave it there. Thank you again for indulging me.
Excellent. Thank you so much. It's such a conceptually rich, empirically rich book and talk. Gives us all enormous food for thought, thinking about the state masquerade, the people's masquerade, how the two interact. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of questions um, while people are gathering their thoughts. Maybe I'll go straight in and sort of invite you. You hinted at it in the talk that obviously since the book has come into the world, there have been events that have you keep having to come back to, and when you're giving these talks. So I wondered if you can say more about how subsequent events or current events have kind of affirmed or modified the thesis of your book, specifically on the Petro-State Masquerade. And oh, I'm very curious about O2's rightward turn that you mentioned as well. Of course, I'm stuck in the 70s, so I'm used to thinking about O2 and George Weeks and being part of the People's Masquerade. And you're saying that O2 has taken a rightward turn and aligning itself with Kamla. So I'd be fascinated to hear more about that and how the current state is acting to contain the insurrectionary possibilities of the People's Masquerade. Maybe that's a lot, so you can pick from that whatever you want.
All excellent questions, Kate. And again, thank you for allowing me to convene here. I hope it doesn't sound too self-serving for me to say that I think recent events have confirmed much of my thesis, right? So again, sort of where I leave the book is thinking about the way that the the sort of masquerade of permanence when it is working, right? For instance, when during the oil boom, um, the sort of abundance of windfall revenues allowed for this masquerade of permanence to create certain kinds of reforms and advances for working people, right? So the petrostate appears as this sort of spout of, again, petrodollars, but also sort of a venue for the advance of working class politics. And I think a lot of including my own postmortem of the 1970s, suggests that precisely when the sort of Black Power movement was preparing to seize state power, the oil boom is really what saved Williams, right? That suddenly he had money to dispense, and suddenly his own masquerade had a sort of new power behind it. What becomes clear is that sort of masquerade is always subtended by state violence. So even during the oil boom, right, we could say that again, sort of Randolph Burroughs and Williams' secret police, the flying squad, was always there to sort of rein in moments of working class insurgency and threats to his own masquerade from folks like George Weeks and the OWTU. I think what we're seeing now is that that mask in many ways is coming off. So perhaps we could even say that Kamala's masquerade is less a mask and more sort of revealing the true face, revealing the fact that brute force and violence is what allows the sort of state to maintain itself. And I think it's no accident that at the same time she's making all of these boisterous claims about, again, sort of stand your ground legislation and load up the matic and kill them violently. She's been very inaccessible in this administration. She basically only makes statements through Twitter. She hardly appears in public. So again, that sort of disappearing from view, that sort of retreat from public view, I think is no accident, right? So I would say, if anything, what we're seeing now is the the sort of removal of the mask, and we're seeing the sort of true character of the petrostate. At the same time, I think that what allows this to continue to reassert the petrostate as opposed to simply sort of brute violence as the source of the state's legitimacy is that this is coinciding, of course, with Kamala brokering these new sort of agreements with ExxonMobil for deep water exploration on the sort of far east coast of Trinidad. She's actually, her administration, although I think Stuart Young claimed responsibility for it, has redrawn that map that I showed you of deep water acreage. So now they just combined, I think, four or five of those blocks, and leased them out under undisclosed terms to ExxonMobil. So still what she's saying is, the same way that Rowley relied on this idea of austerity as a way to rein in the sort of excesses of the petrostate in order to then locate new sources of oil and gas. Kamala's combining that austerity with violence and xenophobia, which then says, we will rein this in through violence and xenophobia, and then we'll allow ExxonMobil to carry out this exploration that supposedly will one day sort of rejuvenate the petrostate in its full glory. So again, I'm always thinking about the relationship between those. For the Clash site, I wrote a postmortem of the election that sort of discusses this at length, and really the tragedy that organized labor was so sort of alienated from the sort of PNM orthodoxy that they aligned themselves with Kamala Prasad-Bissessar and the UNC as she was ramping up all of this right-wing rhetoric. I think what's even more disappointing is that they haven't registered an explicit sort of dissent from her administration, even as we've seen, again, sort of these drone strikes in Caribbean waters, as well as the sort of the U.S. invasion of Venezuela. So that does tell us these are very bleak times indeed, which then necessitates us to look to other locations of working class self-activity other than the trade union. And again, I could talk, there's a longer genealogy about how George Weeks did that at a very bleak moment for the union. So, I think I always remain optimistic or hopeful that, a new rebel faction may emerge. So that's where I'll leave that question. But excellent set of questions, Kate.
Thank you for that answer. There's so much to say. I just thinking when you're speaking about the masquerade slipping, the mask slipping. We've had the Mark Carney speech at Davos, and sort of the masquerade of international law. The mask is sort of being removed. The kind of the idea that we all pretend that there is such a thing as international law. That Carney and is kind of removing that mask. But anyway, I see Gad's hand is up. And just to say again, to reiterate, if you want to put a question in the chat, please do so. Otherwise, use raise hand function, switch on your camera, ask your questions. So Gad, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. That was really interesting. And there are many points, just the way Kate said that there were so many things to discuss. I was really struck by a small point, but nonetheless significant, I think, that there was a view at a certain point you mentioned that oil was actually renewable, could be renewed, which struck me as, odd to say the least. And so what would have been the consequences when that clearly wasn't when that was perceived not to be the case? Not that it wasn't the case, it was never the case. How long did it take to produce this oil? But that it could have been done. And then people realized, of course, it's impossible.
Well, this is what I find interesting, and this is an excellent question. In scientific or technical terms, I think it's now accepted that oil is not renewable, that it's not being continually produced in the subsoil as these technologists thought in the 1930s. At the same time, I mean, we've all lived through these distinct moments where we're told oil is running out, right? We've been told this this was true in the 1970s, that was actually coordinated in part by oil companies in order to produce this image of scarcity and create higher prices per barrel. I would say we saw this again in sort of the early 2000s around the sort of invasion of Iraq, right? All this discussion about peak oil and the last remaining barrels. Today, what we see, we're in yet another oil glut globally, right? That oil is relatively cheap. In fact, there's sort of overproduction and they're locating new reserves in places that we never thought were commercially viable year after year, including, I mean, the idea that Guyana is a major player in the sort of oil sector would have been unthinkable, 15 years ago, you know, before 2015. So I think that that tells us that even if this is technically not scientifically true, what's a lot more difficult to reckon with is the fact that this masquerade of permanence draws its power from the fact that, again, the idea that Trinidad could strike a major commercial find off the East Coast in these sort of deep water blocks, it's quite possible. You know, they're adjacent to the blocks that Exxon was exploring in Guyana. The question really becomes sort of who is compelled to bear the brunt of this economic downturn in the meantime. Is it the state? Is it the multinational corporations? Is it the local business sector? Or is it working people themselves? And that's where I think that this masquerade comes into view. The fact that they continue to be able to appeal to this promise, this distant promise of future production, whether it indeed comes true or not. The fact that that's been so effective at sort of securing consent for these politics of austerity and now a politics of violence and xenophobia, I think is precisely where we should sort of be, alert to. So, that for me is the one place that we've seen a serious challenge to that sort of hegemony of the petrostate is from workers themselves. Again, when sort of rank and file workers were at the helm of trade union outfits, but also when we've seen sort of independent workers' self-organization, like we saw in 1937, like we saw in 1970. So for me, the question becomes sort of how do we cultivate a response of the same order as those political moments. And I think that's an enormous challenge. I don't mean to suggest that that's going to be easy, but I think it's necessary. I think that there's really no alternative.
Great, thank you. That's great.
Steve, go ahead.
Uh, yeah, going back to the right wing turn, as you refer to it in the oilfield workers trade union, and I noticed in the chat that Dave Dunkley has mentioned it as well. I it it did seem to me almost like dropping off the edge of a cliff, if you see what I mean. I mean, there were they seemed to, and I've still kept some of the videos from the news. They seem to be selling it as opposition to neoliberalism, and so on. I mean, I know some of the leaders of the oilfield workers trade union. I haven't actually been able
Likewise.
to speak to many of them lately, if you see what I mean. But I mean, did they know what they were doing? Were they deliberately conning people, or were they conned themselves, or what? Have you got any knowledge of that, or is it just sort of something that will come out in the fullness of time? Because it seems to me that there was, from uh, really quite militant speeches, quite militant activity immediately before the election, through to complete silence and sort of no attempt to and complete silence in talking to some of their friends overseas as well.
It's an excellent question. I see the question in the chat as well. I haven't spoken to my friends in the OWTU since the election, so I can't tell you what their, sort of privately what their temperament is. What I will say again, we should distinguish, I think it's important to distinguish between the OWTU executive, and again, the people I mentioned are actually members of the executive, and the rank and file. And again, I think there are moments where those two have aligned in the sort of history of Trinidad and Tobago, and there are moments where they drift apart. And I think we're certainly seeing a moment where they've drifted apart because I think to David's sort of comment in the chat, I think it's correct that a lot of OWTU rank and file are PNM supporters, and many of them just chose to sort of boycott the polls. They stayed home. I don't think they necessarily in droves voted for UNC. What we did see though is that, OWTU fielded two candidates for the UNC in these elections, I believe in La Brea and in Point Fortin, both of which sort of secured those seats, helped to secure the sort of parliamentary victory for the UNC. So clearly the executive has cast their lot with the UNC in very formal terms. It's not even just sort of privately, or that they've sort of lent support to the UNC. They fielded candidates, right? That were joint candidates of OWTU and the UNC. So that begs this question of, is this a moment in which the rank and file can reassert itself? I think the challenge now is that, as we know, that sector is much less organized than it was in the 1970s, and just claims far fewer numbers of workers, because, again, a lot of the TNT economy has shifted from the energy sector to, the service sector in particular, or to unemployment, right? So that sort of poses a very different question about who will be at the vanguard of working class organization today. And it won't necessarily be the sort of trade union leaders or political parties. Again, I think the broader question then becomes sort of, what was the strategy behind this? And again, I'm sympathetic to the fact that the OWTU had indeed grown tired of the PNM's relentless neoliberalism. And I think you could argue, actually, Steve, that this was them aligning themselves against neoliberalism, but from the right. And, the question then becomes, why do they think that sort of right-wing nationalism and xenophobia is indeed a legitimate challenge to a neoliberal economic order? And it parallels in many ways, again, the way that sort of Trump in the United States has fashioned himself as a right-wing critic of neoliberalism. I think the one thing we can't call Trump is a neoliberal, but he certainly is upholding the brute force of multinational capital and its sort of fusion with the state, which is, again, is what we're seeing now in the Southern Caribbean and Venezuela. So I think that we have to diagnose properly. But again, it probably means that we have to be alert to both independent rank and file activity and workers' activity outside of the union, which, we could talk about it more, but this is the same thing that happened in the 1930s. And this is also what happened in the 1960s ahead of, again, George Weeks rising to serve as president general. So this has happened before, and it may be time to sort of evangelize those histories again.
I'd be all in favor of that plan. So I'm going to some of the questions in the chat. So there's one from Nicole Rochelle Moore, who says, given that Kamala seems to be copying from the Trumpian playbook in some of the ways in which she's conducting her leadership, don't you feel it's more of a case of playing another mass? And then a question after that, maybe we can take them in groups, is a very good question from Jay Lawrence, who says, who does the oil enrich? Whose consent has been sought? What will happen to the petrodollar?
To the first question, I think it's important for me to clarify what I mean by masquerade, which is to say that a masquerade is not empty. And any of us who have played Mas, we know that masquerades are not empty. They're suffused with material significance and value, semiotic significance. So when I say that Kamala is playing yet another Mas, I'm not saying that the sort of violence that she is promising is not real, right? In fact, it's very real. I think what understanding it to be a masquerade then compels us to think about how we can, again, sort of evangelize our own masquerades of power from below, and not just as sort of a momentary diversion or momentary sort of cultural expression, but again, as a sort of legitimate contest over who holds power in Trinidad and Tobago today. I think this goes to actually Gabriel's question in the chat as well. This question about the relationship between culture and politics, and whether sort of cultural resistance sometimes is taken to be a false stand-in for the actual thing of, political power and insurgency. This is where I think it's crucial that we resist any efforts to reduce Carnival and the masquerade to be merely cultural. I also dispute that definition of culture as something that's sort of separate from politics. But I think this is where we have to think about sort of why has the contemporary why has mas today been entirely subordinated to the state? And sort of when it says carnivals permitted, when and where fetes are permitted, and why is it being sort of divorced from the political sphere? So I'm thinking both about moments when the carnival, the masquerade itself was deeply politicized. I mean, people talk about the Mas in 1970 as one that was deeply politicized and led directly into the sort of insurgencies of that year. But I'm also thinking about, yeah, how do we appropriate these forms for the purposes of politics and self-organization and not allow it to be seen as simply a cultural diversion, which it never was, right? So again, anyone who's been to the Canberra reenactment knows that the very origins of Carnival are about a contest over power and not merely sort of an exercise or diversion from politics as such. To Lawrence's question, again, I think there's a simple answer here, which is that oil enriches multinational companies, and also at opportune moments, it enriches the state and its private sector partners locally, right? And I think that the former is always very clear in these conversations. I think the latter is often neglected, which is to say that one of the objects of our critique is not just the multinationals, but their sort of, again, the fusion of multinational power with state power in a place like Trinidad and Tobago. And I think this has become very explicit again with Kamala, right? That she makes no sort of apologies for her unwillingness to speak to citizens directly, but her willingness to entertain, executives from ExxonMobil or sort of representatives of the US State Department or Pentagon at her house in Siparia. But this has been the character of the post-colonial state ever since its inception, right? And this is, Kate mentioned my article about James and Williams and the struggle for Chagaramas. I think that ever since sort of Eric Williams chose to permit the Americans to remain in Trinidad and in that sort of betray what was desired by the sort of anti-colonial mass movement, there's been sort of a clear partnership between the multinationals, the state, and the local business sector that's relegated working people themselves to the margins. And there have been various efforts through that time for working people to assert themselves, right? And to say that we're going to sort of break up this masquerade of the Petro-State. And that again is what we have to look to now. So I'd say again, I think the important thing is that the oil enriches multinationals, but it also enriches a sort of rentier or comprador class that also has to be one of the objects of our critique. Yeah.
Thank you. Then there's the question from Stephen Howard, which is if the US takes control of Venezuelan oil and claims the disputed territories with Guyana as belonging to Venezuela, what happens to the majority of Guyanese oil-rich territories, especially offshore?
Excellent question, Kate. I said I wouldn't get myself into trouble on this call, but I mean, I think first the fact is that the US, at least in name, according to what the US State Department is saying and what the interim president of Venezuela is saying, the US has taken control of Venezuelan oil for the moment, at least. This is also to say that the idea that US multinationals were incompatible with the sort of Bolivarian socialist project has never been true. I mean, Chevron has operated in Venezuela uninterrupted up until today through this entire period of sanctions. They've always had a special license. So um, the project of Bolivarian socialism was always predicated on actually a relationship with US multinationals who would create revenue from the oil sector, which then would be directed into, again, sort of new social programs and reforms. Um, my sense is that, and I've written about the border dispute with Guyana previously. I mean, first it should be said that, the efforts to revive the border dispute by Maduro are really just a empty chauvinistic nationalism, and honestly was a really sort of unforced error. You'll notice, Chavez had basically backed off of the border issue entirely during his tenure. And I think that that sort of desperation revealed that Maduro was not prepared for a sort of new landscape of oil and gas operations where Guyana was actually a major actor, right? That was, as I said, unthinkable in the sort of formative moments of Chavismo from, 1998 to, let's say, 2010. So I think that that lack of preparation led to an unforced error. What I will say now, I think it's very unlikely with the US in control of Venezuelan oil and in this tacit compact or not so tacit compact with the PSUV in Venezuela under Delcy Rodriguez. It's very unlikely that you're going to see Venezuela test the border issue again. Because if you remember, the US already controls ExxonMobil controls all of the oil in Guyana's offshore. So it'd be if the US controls both sides of the border, it would be very inopportune and nonsensical for them to challenge themselves, right? And I think that we're dealing with a situation now where the US is claiming basically sort of unmitigated hegemony over the entire sort of oil and gas resources of the Southern Caribbean and the Venezuelan coast. So again, when I say these are very bleak times, this is what I mean. What that means for the border issue, though, is that I think that will go away for the time being. It's something that's always revived at sort of, again, particularly at moments when the Venezuelan economy was in decline, much like Kamala appeals to these new offshore reserves as the promise for Trinidad's revival as a petrostate. That's also what Maduro was doing at the time. That was jingoist nationalism, and the fact that he was willing to sort of reduce himself to that empty masquerade, I think tells us a lot about where the Bolivarian project had arrived at that moment versus an earlier moment where, again, as I said, Chavez was willing to sort of leave the issue aside.
Thank you. Now we're running up against the clock, so I think the one from Soraya is not so much a question as a comment. So you can choose if you want to respond there about the US military might being another kind of masquerade full of meanings, but different from reality. And then Stephen's question about will Suriname's untapped reserves be exploited? And if so, when?
Mhm. Just to answer the second first, I think, Suriname's offshore resources are already being tapped, certainly not to the extent or at the rate that Guyana has. But we can certainly expect that to continue. Again, the fact that, the sort of Guyanese offshore has now signaled to multinationals that there are massive reserves in sort of adjacent regions, which is why ExxonMobil is investing on sort of Trinidad's easternmost territory, maritime territory, as well as in Suriname. So I think we can expect that to continue, in the future. To Soraya's question, which again is excellent, this is something I'm actually trying to right through in a new short piece right now, which is really to sort of diagnose the contours of Trump's masquerade, right? Because we've seen not just these strikes on small sort of fishing vessels and other sort of boats in the Southern Caribbean that he claims is about fighting narco trafficking in the region. We all know on this call that this is not actually doing anything to fight narco traffic in the region, whether or not these boats are trafficking illicit, drugs, right? This is not actually going to shut down the entire operations of narco trafficking in the hemisphere. So the question is why? Why is he committed to this? And as we know, Trump has sort of came up politically as a reality TV star. So he's very attached to the image, the spectacle. And it's no accident that these operations haven't been conducted silently. They've basically been live streamed, that he's constantly sharing these very explicit videos of the strikes on boats in the Southern Caribbean. So I think what he's trying to do there, and with, again, sort of very violent and fatal effect for working people in the region, is that he's deploying this as a spectacle to secure consent from his own rank and file, his own party loyalists, that by saying these are drug boats and we're taking them out, and Maduro is the leader of a drug cartel. All of that was sort of the masquerade that prepared for the consent for the invasion in Venezuela from his own followers. So, my argument is that he, again, sacrificed the lives of working people in the Caribbean. Again, I think it's a sacrifice for us. It's just sort of brute force and violence for him, as a way to create a false narrative that then he can masquerade as truth. And this is something, again, Trump knows very well. He's done this through reality TV. He loves to say things that are explicitly untrue, but insists they're true. And this is where I think we need, again, a sort of a different analytic and a different political response. That it's not enough to say, Trump is a bumbling fool and Trump is saying things that aren't true, because he actually allows the alternative facts, the lies to masquerade as truth. The question is, how do we then sort of interrupt his ability to do that? And that requires an entirely different sort of formulation of politics than the one that, the sort of liberals prescribe. So that's my short answer. The long answer is I'm working on a piece that elaborates on this a bit more.
Thank you. I'm going to give the last question to Dr. Ivelaw Griffith, who says that Kamala has a mask also in relation to CARICOM, the CARICOM family, which is contributing to the fracturing of the regional body. Her platitudes and posture are positively unhelpful. So if you can respond concisely to that, if you may.
Mm-hmm. This is an excellent question, too, which I've written a bit about. Again, there's clearly a fracture within CARICOM right now. But my read on this is that there's a fracture over the extent to which CARICOM will be a partner with U.S. empire in the region. So you'll notice that Kamala is taking the sort of approach of she wants an unmitigated and total collaboration with U.S. empire that delights in the death of her own citizens, delights in the death of other folks, both in the Caribbean Sea and the Eastern Pacific. And that becomes part of her own sort of masquerade or performance of power. Now, the rest of CARICOM has sort of departed from this and saying that they feel like, again, the spectacle that Trump is indulging in is too much, right? That this is crossed over from legitimate collaboration with the US and the Pentagon to something that is more egregious. So I think that the trouble with this is that the CARICOM position is still an endorsement of US empire, but under sort of in kinder and gentler terms. They want to return to the form of US power that proliferated under Biden, that proliferated under Obama, right? Where the US continued to occupy Puerto Rico, continued to have military installations in Aruba and the ABC Islands. So the question then becomes, how do we, again, for instance, working people and civil society groups who are mobilizing against the sort of US strikes in the region. How do we arrive at a place where we can denounce the US presence in the Caribbean altogether, right? That we should be just as focused on the US and its permanent presence in Puerto Rico, its now sort of bases in the DR, as well as its sort of naval and air force presence in Aruba and Curacao. So that for me is what I'm sort of thinking about, that these are different modes of the same masquerade. But just as I sort of suggested that I think Kamala and Rowley are actually more kindred than they appear, right? But it's about sort of one is unabashed and explicit in its endorsement. One tries to broker this quietly. I think that, again, is something that we have to revisit and think about what kind of politics are we trying to advance that is independent of both of those tendencies.
Thank you so much. Before we wrap up and thank you properly, I just want to draw attention to our next talk, which is on February the 11th. And I think it continues this theme of extractivism, colonialism, neocolonialism. It is by Ada Rumer, and she will be speaking on coloniality in Quisqueya, organizing on the Haitian-Dominican border. And she's done some great anthropological work on that in that border area. So I'd invite you all to return on the 11th of February. The details will be on the UCL Institute of the Americas webpage. Everybody sign up. But most of all, I just want to really thank again our wonderful speaker. There's lots of appreciation in the comments, and that's just an indication of the richness of the work, how many conversations that it's generating in the chat, and it's going to continue to generate. I'm very glad to hear that some of these issues that you've that have been raised in the comments are things that you're going to write about further. And I think if there's any students in the audience, I think this is just a really great illustration of the importance of studying what you call in your preface a big, small place. I think these big, small places have so much to tell us. And I really appreciate you taking your time to join us this afternoon, this morning, wherever you are in the world, to hear this talk. And thanks again, Ryan. Great job.
Thank you so much
Yep.
for having me. I appreciate it. And thank you for all the questions as well.
Yeah, very good. Very good.
Wonderful.
Ryan, I have while people are shutting it down, I was going to ask you something which is, relevant in a sense, but the all what's happened recently, what has struck me, and I'm not the only person I'm sure thought about it, is the effect on Cuba and what the United States will do about supplying oil to Cuba from Venezuela.
Well, this is one of my major questions, but as I said, a lot sort of remains to be seen in terms of what the terms of the agreement that's been brokered between Washington and Caracas is, right? So, does that include cutting off Cuba from Venezuelan oil supplies?
For sure.
It seems that that is the case. And I've even heard anecdotally that black market prices for gas have skyrocketed in Cuba in recent days and weeks.
Emily
And then,
can probably speak to that.
yeah,
Emily Forrest is in the call. She might be able to tell us.
I would love to know if these reports are accurate, as well as the question of whether sort of Mexico will be able to sort of fill the gap to any substantial extent, which is also what the sort of active discussion is, whether we're going to see the same sort of policing of shipping channels by Trump, whether they're, legal or not. So I think that's, I mean, if we take Rubio at his word, that is precisely what, or is one of the principal objectives of all of their activity in the hemisphere has been about Cuba. So certainly it remains to be seen.
Yeah. Anyway, something's have to go. We can pursue this, but we have to go. So yeah. Thanks very much.
Thank you again.
Okay, bye everybody.